Hi there and welcome to this video lecture on Stoicism for Introduction to Philosophy. And in this video I'm going to talk generally about the history of Stoicism, make some connections with psychology, and we'll talk about the three disciplines of Stoicism, which are kind of practical sort of ways of behaving that embody mindfulness. And we'll talk about the three theoretical topics of Stoicism as well. So we'll get a general idea of Stoicism's view of life, and we'll see that it's a very practical philosophy. In other words, it's focused on the idea of living better, what it means to live well, and it tries to develop an understanding that allows us to sort of live out that idea. So this is Albert Ellis, and he's the founder of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which was invented in the 1950s. It was called REBT by Ellis, a kind of rational and behavioral therapy, and it subsequently became cognitive behavioral therapy. And what's interesting is that Ellis gives credit to the Stoic philosophers for inspiring his idea of CBT. And there's a view of Epictetus which is really crucial to understanding Stoicism, and it's something that Ellis kind of picked up on in his psychological work. And it's a statement of Epictetus where he says, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them." In other words, it's not things that disturb us, it's our perspective or our view about the things that we see, the things that we hear, the things that occur to us. So the key thing is about the beliefs which we develop about the things which we see, about the things which we perceive and hear, and so on. So the REBT model has this kind of ABC structure, where it starts with something called an activating event, a kind of activating event that sort of starts the kind of chain the kind of chain of consequences. The activating event could be something you perceive, something you see, something you hear. Now, what's important for Stoicism is that our emotions depend upon our beliefs. So Stoicism takes a very sort of cognitive view about what beliefs are. They're not just emotional states. They're not just sort of, irrational kind of states that make us, very agitated and so on. But they're driven by beliefs, and it's beliefs that kind of drive our emotions. So on the basis of an activating event, we form a belief, and it's the belief that's problematic. And this leads to emotional behavioral consequences. Okay. So if we sort of think about how this might work, let's sort of say our activating event is you're just walking down the street, just sort of taking a walk, and you see a friend on the other side of the street. So you wave to your friend, but your friend doesn't wave back. Now, what beliefs might you form on the basis of this event? Okay, so you might form a belief that, well, maybe my friend doesn't like me. Maybe something's happened and there's a rift between myself and my friend. Maybe my friend hates me. So what's happening is you start forming beliefs on the basis of the perception, what you see, and it's the belief that's problematic. The belief takes up things which are not there in the event, right? So in the activating event, all we see is I wave to my friend didn't wave back. But we don't know anything about why. But belief comes in and starts speculating and starts sort of creating stories about the activating event. And it's on the basis of the belief that we we experience the emotional and behavioral consequences of thinking that things are terrible, something's gone wrong, something's happened, on the basis of the beliefs that we form. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a kind of rational technique and works rationally on beliefs, it's not working on the unconscious, it's not one of those psychologies that sort of, focuses on our unconscious thoughts and that kind of thing. It focuses on our actual beliefs. And what it tries to do is to make us aware of those beliefs so that we can effectively change them, so that we can introduce better beliefs which are more attuned to reality and which don't have the same emotional and behavioral consequences as the beliefs which we form when we kind of go beyond the event and go beyond what's there and sort of put our fears and our worries into what's happened and form a belief on that basis. So cognitive behavioral therapy draws upon the central view of Stoicism, that we're not disturbed by things, it's the views which we take of them. In other words, it's the beliefs which we form on the basis of our views of our perceptions and our ideas and what we hear. It's the beliefs which we form about those things which causes problems for us. So Stoicism, it's called Stoicism from the ancient Greek name for the porch, the kind of front step, which is where the Stoics used to teach in the marketplace of Athens. Stoicism is usually said to be founded by Zeno of Citium, who came to Athens and founded the school. So the Stoa was literally the porch of the house where the philosophers met. And other notable Stoic philosophers include Zeno's pupil Cleanthes and Cleanthes' pupil Chrysippus. Stoicism became popular in the Roman Empire. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, is one of the most widely known Stoics, and he wrote a book about the conduct of his life. One of the sad things about Stoicism is that most of their works didn't survive because after the Stoics, there came a sort of Christian period in Western history, and the Christian scholars were not fans of the Stoics. They liked other Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, but they didn't care for the Stoics, probably because of their sort of pantheistic view of the universe. So they didn't bother to kind of keep the Stoic texts or to sort of safeguard them, and so they were lost over time and gradually lost. So a lot of things we know about the Stoics, especially the Greek Stoics, comes from secondary sources, particularly Roman sources who actually had the books available and wrote about them in their time, sort of hundreds of years later. So a lot of sort of learning about Stoicism is kind of reconstructing and trying to use other sources to understand what the Stoics really thought. Okay, so the Stoics were around from about 300 BC or BCE to about 200 AD in the Roman period. Marcus Aurelius being one of the last Stoics in the sort of historical timeline. So it started in the kind of with the Greeks in the sort of BC period, and then it kind of shifted to sort of Roman thinkers like Seneca and Cicero and Marcus Aurelius in the Roman period. So, why might we be interested in Stoicism today? Well, Stoicism is actually very different from academic philosophy today, the kind of philosophy that those of us who are philosophers work in universities today. Stoicism is very different from the typical thing that we do because it was a fully fledged theory of the art of living. So it's not just a theory about how we think. It's not just a theory about sort of part of the way we work or we operate, or about how our sort of cognitive equipment works. It's a theory about how to live, or how to live better. And I think this is nicely illustrated by this this view of what education is for is nicely illustrated by this quote from Epictetus. He says, "For even sheep do not vomit up their grass and show to the shepherds how much they have eaten, but when they have internally digested the pasture, they produce externally wool and milk. Do you also show not your theorems to the uninstructed, but show the acts which come from their digestion?" So the point of learning things, the point of education here, is not what Epictetus calls sort of vomiting up or just regurgitating what you've learned, as we typically do, right? In exams and sort of essays, we kind of regurgitate, students regurgitate things they've been taught. Epictetus says, no, that's not the idea. The idea is to convert what you've learned into something positive, into something good about your life. Just as the sheep sort of takes milk and it takes pasture and transforms it into wool and milk. So take the instruction and convert it into something in your life, convert it into a form of living well. And that's really the Stoic maxim, that what we're interested in is being able to live better. So the Stoics are always looking for ways to increase the connection, to sort of firm up the connection between what we know about the world when we think and how we act, and how we bring the principles of our action into our practice, into the things we do in our daily lives. That's a central part of Stoicism. And a lot of Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius, and in fact the Meditations, is basically a journal. A lot of Stoics kept journals because journaling is a particularly good way of bringing about that connection between your thinking and your practice, and trying to sort of think about connecting the two and sort of reflecting on how you do that by journaling and thinking about your actions every day. Stoicism has been described by Pierre Hadot, a famous French philosopher, as a form of spiritual exercises. So a spiritual exercise is an exercise for the soul, just as physical exercise is an exercise for the body. So a student of philosophy who wants to master the art of living, we need to train in the same way an athlete or craftsman trains for the task at hand. So that's really the thinking here, that we kind of training in order to master the art of living. And that means something different than just memorizing things and then regurgitating them. That means being able to incorporate what we learn into the way we act, into what we do in life, into who we are as persons. And that's the central idea of Stoicism, that we want to translate our learning into living well. And we're students because what we care about is not learning for its own sake. What we care about is learning that enables us to live better, and to be able to act in more accomplished and better ways. Okay, now there's something very radical about Stoicism here, in its view of what we should consider important, what we should consider good. And for the Stoics, only virtue is good. And virtue, from the Greek word arete, basically means acting well, or excellence in action. So it derives from the idea of excellence. And somebody who has virtue is somebody who is capable of acting well, acting according to the right ethical principles. For Stoicism, that's the only thing that's good in itself, right? So that's the only thing we should really care about, is being able to act well according to the right principles. As long as we do that, Stoics say, we have all that we need for happiness. So all of the things that we usually care about, things like fame, wealth, power, beauty, life itself, and pleasure, all of those things for the Stoics, they're what the Stoics call indifferent. So they're not good in themselves, and they can often be negative or bad for us, right? So for example, wealth. Wealth can enable us to live more comfortably. Perhaps sometimes it can enable us to live well, but it can also do the opposite, right? Wealth can be self-destructive, and it can sort of lead us to make self-destructive choices. And you can say the same thing about fame, power, beauty, etc. In some circumstances, those things are good. In some circumstances, those things might be bad, and they might get in the way of us living well. So that's why for the Stoics, all of those things are indifferent. Sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not, but they all have to be seen in the context of virtue. That's the only thing that matters. So if we have to sacrifice wealth, power, fame, beauty in order to preserve virtue, in order to act well, that's the key to happiness for the Stoics. So none of these things on this list are good in themselves. And similarly, when we ask the question, what is evil? For the Stoics, only vice is evil. Vice is just the opposite of virtue, acting badly, acting according to wrong principles, acting unethically. So all of the things that we often think of as evil, notoriety, in other words, having a bad reputation, poverty, weakness, ugliness, death, all of those things for the Stoics are not evil in themselves. In fact, they can often be either good or bad depending on the circumstances. To take death as the most radical one, for the Stoics, death is not an evil if the alternative is acting shamefully, terribly, and unethically. In those cases, our obligation is to accept death because it's preferable to vice and acting badly. Poverty can sometimes, we think of poverty as a very bad thing, and of course sometimes it's very hard to manage. It leads to a lot of sort of health problems and so on. But it doesn't always stop us from acting well. And for the Stoics, the really bad thing that we want to avoid is acting badly. That's the thing that sort of corrupts our soul. So as long as we avoid that, as long as we avoid sort of vice and acting badly, then we're sort of, we're on the right track. Okay, so everything that's not vice or virtue, acting well or acting badly, everything else is what the Stoics call indifferent. So what that means is it can't affect true happiness. It's irrelevant to the question of our happiness, whether we have fame or a bad reputation, notoriety, whether we're wealthy or in poverty, whether we're powerful or weak. None of that makes a difference to whether we act well or whether we act badly. Sometimes wealth is helpful, sometimes it's not. Sometimes perhaps poverty can be better than wealth in helping us to sort of reach the right principles, because maybe with wealth it becomes harder to resist the kind of temptations that come with it. So none of these things are fundamentally important to our happiness for the Stoics. And I want to emphasize this is a radical view, right? That when we think of our view of happiness, it includes things like wealth, power, life, pleasure, etc. And the Stoics are very clear in saying these things don't count as true happiness. Okay, and the Stoics talk about this idea of oikeiosis. And the idea is that the principal desire of all animals is to preserve themselves. So they'll reject whatever is harmful to their constitution and pursue what will benefit us. So we seek to persevere according to our nature, appropriating what is beneficial to us. This is part of the idea of living according to nature. To the Stoics, that we live according to our own rational nature, so we seek to enter into sort of relations with things that benefit and that maybe allow us to express our own rational nature. So since we humans are rational beings, we seek to preserve our own constitution as rational beings. And this is part of the reason why virtue is the only true good, because only virtue preserves and satisfies our rational nature. In other words, it's only when we're being virtuous that we're acting from the right kind of rational principles that express who we are as human beings. Right? When we're sort of tempted by wealth, when we're tempted by power, and those are the reasons why we're asking, those are the reasons why we're acting, then that is sort of going against our rational nature. Where the way that we act as rational beings is to express our action express the principles, the ethical principles that we hold through our actions. So we act on the basis of principle. And that's how we express our nature as rational beings. Okay, so the Stoics identified 3 theoretical topics. And we'll see in a second, these are linked to the 3 disciplines of Stoicism. And the 3 disciplines are these practical techniques, these sort of almost these mindfulness techniques, I think we can call them that, the Stoics developed to enable us to live in a way that we can express our rational nature, and to live in a way that we can avoid harmful emotions and harmful passions. So the first theoretical topic is physics, which is natural philosophy or ancient natural science. And the Stoics were kind of pantheistic and deterministic thinkers. By pantheistic, I mean they had a view of God and the universe, where the universe and God are one and the same. So the divine and the universe are one thing. There's no sort of separate creator who creates the universe. It's all one unfolding system, one unfolding organism. So the Stoics tend to think of nature as a kind of unfolding rational force. It's almost anthropomorphized. And that's sort of a pantheistic idea, that nature is this sort of living, unfolding force. The view is also deterministic, because it holds that everything that happens is determined, is caused by prior happenings. So the view of the universe leaves no room for chance, leaves no room for kind of divine intervention. It's just a sort of unfolding, deterministic, causal-based system. So the second theoretical topic is the study of ethics, and this is where we're concerned with action and acting well. So ethics is basically the study of the good life, where we learn what it means to act well and what it means to act according to virtue. And the third study, logic, as we'll see, is the study of language and its rules. And it's about how we understand language and the way that it works. Okay, so now that we have a sense of the 3 kind of theoretical subject areas, we'll see how those are linked to the 3 disciplines of Stoicism. So before we get into that, let's recall this statement of Epictetus, which we sort of encountered briefly before, but here's a different statement of it. There are things which are within our power, and there are things which are beyond our power. Within our power are opinion, aim, desire, aversion, and in one word, whatever affairs are our own. Beyond our power are body, property, reputation, office, and in one word, whatever are not properly our own affairs. So Epictetus counsels us to focus on the things that are within our power. And what's within our power? What we think, what we aim at, what we desire, what we're averse towards, what we sort of reject, move away from. So it's what we control is our reactions and our responses to things. Beyond our power are body, which is physical property, or sort of physical existing things that we don't control, reputation, of course, it'd be nice if we could control that, but we can't. So everything else is not properly our own affair. All that belongs to us is what we can control, which is our reactions and responses to things. So as we'll see, the three disciplines are about sort of setting out how we can sort of live according to this idea, how we can focus on the things that are within our power, and not be sort of blown off course by the things that are not within our power. So the first discipline is called the discipline of assent or logic, and it relates to the study of language. Now, like animals, we sense and perceive things outside of us using our senses. And this produces an image, what the Greeks call a fantasia, in the soul. So we perceive something and then we perceive an image of that thing in our soul or in our mind. The image gives rise to an inner discourse in the soul which forms a positive or negative judgment about it. So as we saw, we might sort of, we see our friend not waving and we say, this is awful, this is frightening, this is terrible. So we form a judgment about the image that we see on the basis of perception, hearing, or however else we sort of sense and perceive. So the discipline here involves withholding assent to the judgment. So here we've got to recognize there is just this perception, and the judgment is sort of added by us. And when we notice that, we can begin to withhold the judgment. And so the Stoics call this, when we just have the perception, the Stoics call this the fantasia cataleptike. So it's just the perception of the thing that we see, without us adding the judgment, this is good, this is awful, this is frightening. So we sort of withhold the kind of emotional reaction, and we just hold the actual judgment itself. So this is called the discipline of assent. The second discipline, which is related to ethics, is the discipline of impulse. Impulse or will is concerned with our motor functions, so the movements towards objects produced by our perceptions. So it's an active principle that expresses our nature in action. So this is where we're active. We're not acted on by other things, by things that we perceive, but we're actually sort of acting and expressing our nature in action. So ethics is about, the discipline of impulse is about disciplining ourselves to act according to our nature as rational beings, according to the principles and ideals that are within us. So we're acting according to our own ethical principles, not being sort of influenced by our reactions to things we see and we hear, but putting our own ethical principles into practice. The third discipline, the discipline of desire, is related to the study of physics. So desire and passion are what we feel in response to what is outside us. So in contrast to ethics, this is an area of passivity. External events affect us and make us feel a certain way. They might make us feel sad that something bad has happened, whether it's a kind of natural disaster like an earthquake, a volcano eruption, whether it's a kind of a human-caused disaster or a sort of, a kind of a human-caused kind of event, something that maybe leads to harm to a certain group of people. Maybe it's not intentional, but these events make us feel a certain way. So the discipline of desire involves learning to be indifferent to that which does not depend on us. So coming back to Epictetus's idea of that which is up to us and that which is not up to us. In the discipline of desire, what we're doing is learning to focus only on that which depends on us. And as we see, we control our actions and we control how we respond to things. But we don't control anything else externally. So we have to develop this indifference to what does not depend on us, And the Stoics, remember, had this view of the universe as a kind of rational system. So in being indifferent to it, what we're doing is kind of endorsing the rational unfolding of the universe, and just anticipating and expecting that the universe is sort of operating according to causal rational laws, that it's not just a kind of random thing. And for the Stoics, that gives them a certain comfort that the universe is just a kind of rational system. And so we can just sort of let it do its thing and be indifferent to the way that it works, and focus on what we can control instead. So to summarize here, we've got the discipline of desire, the discipline of judgment, and the discipline of action. So in the discipline of desire, we're learning to see ourselves as elements within a larger, unified, rational physical system. And so we're seeing that system as a kind of rational system. So it's just unfolding in its own way. So nothing that happens in it need be taken by us as things that are sort of scary or frightening to us. It's all natural, it's all necessity, it's just the universe sort of unfolding in its rational way. In the discipline of judgment, we learn to give assent only to the impressions that are adequate. So here we learn only to to accept the things which match the impression. And here we come to adopt the perspective of the cosmos as a whole, according to which nothing is good or bad in itself. In the discipline of action, our primary impulse is towards the preservation of our own nature as rational beings. So we can see the three disciplines nicely summarized in this quote from Marcus Aurelius. Erase your representation, your fantasia, check your impulse to action, extinguish your desire, orexis. So the representation is the logic of sticking to what's there. Check your impulse to action, make sure it's based on your ethical principle, and extinguish your desire. So focus only on what you can control, not your sort of feelings and emotions about things outside that are not within your control. Keep your directing principle, your hegemonicon within your power. That's the central Stoic idea of the soul, and we'll talk about that in a different place. Okay, so to summarize here, in the Stoic philosophical life depends on one's ability to master our inner discourse, so how we represent things to ourselves in our own minds. As we saw, it's not things that trouble us, but our judgments about things. And if we see that a book like the Meditations, are Marcus's attempt to practice Stoic spiritual exercises. So the goal is to transform the inner discourse by meditating on the Stoic dogmas and making them come alive in the current moment and context. So we come back here to the idea of Stoicism as this sort of attempt to bridge our intellectual knowledge and our sort of practical behavior. And the best way of doing that is by sort of this thinking and writing about your judgments in your day. And that's what Marcus Aurelius does in the Meditations. Basically, the Meditations were not written as a book for other people to read. Marcus is writing the Meditations as a journal to remind him of what's important, to make his thoughts come alive in the present, in the current context. And this shows very nicely the attitude of Stoicism, that it's about how we can sort of make our ideas come alive in our action, how we can embody the things we believe in, how we behave and how we act. And that's a central point of Stoicism, and it expresses their fundamental interest in ethics and acting well.